Seneca, also known as Lucius Annaeus Seneca, was born in the heart of one of the most turbulent periods in the history of Rome, and his life became a reflection of the contradictions of his age. Philosopher and politician, a man of power and a thinker of detachment, wealthy and influential yet a preacher of moderation and simplicity. This duality is what makes him, even today, one of the most fascinating and studied figures of Stoicism. For many, he is the true link between ancient philosophy and the modern search for meaning, for he managed to translate the harshness of Stoicism into practical advice on how to deal with death, wealth, friendship, and time. When we open his Letters to Lucius, we get the feeling that Seneca is speaking directly to us, as if he had foreseen the anxieties of the 21st century. Anxiety, information overload, the race for money, and fear of death. In the introduction to a study on Seneca, it is impossible not to notice how his words echo in a world that is no longer Roman, but still equally unstable and marked by social pressures. In the book, On the Shortness of Life, he warns that we are not given a short life, but we make it short, reminding us that humanity's greatest tragedy is not death, but the waste of time that precedes it. This idea, so ancient and yet so modern, explains why Seneca remains a spiritual guide for generations seeking quick and solid answers to universal dilemmas. He does not speak only to philosophers or scholars. He speaks to the exhausted worker, the lost youth, the dissatisfied rich man, and the regretful elder. His philosophy transcends centuries because it starts from a point common to all human beings. Life is fragile, fleeting, and precisely because of this, it must be lived well. Beyond the practical relevance of his ideas, Seneca's trajectory is also an invitation to reflect on the paradoxes of the human condition. He lived surrounded by wealth, but wrote about the importance of detachment. He was the tutor of Emperor Nero, one of the most cruel in Rome's history, yet he defended virtue and temperance. He accumulated political power as a senator and advisor, but dedicated his nights to philosophical writing. This coexistence of opposites made him a target of criticism, even in his own time. Was he a hypocrite, incapable of living what he preached, or a realist, aware that even philosophers are trapped by the circumstances of their era? It is within this conflict that we find the essence of Seneca, and perhaps it is precisely this contradiction that makes him so human and so close to us. In the field of philosophy, Seneca occupies a unique place. Unlike Marcus Aurelius, whose work appears as a personal diary of reflections, or Epictetus, who left no writings of his own and was recorded by his disciples, Seneca addressed a real interlocutor, his friend Lucilius. This choice made his letters true manuals of life, full of advice, warnings, and maxims that could be applied to daily living. The direct and at times poetic language, combined with concrete examples from Roman life, ensured that his texts were not only preserved, but continually revisited. The impact is so great that even today we see his phrases circulating on social networks, motivational videos, and lectures on self-knowledge, as if they were aphorisms tailor-made for the digital age. To understand who Seneca was is therefore much more than reciting dates or positions. It is to dive into the life of a man who lived at the epicenter of imperial power but never stopped looking inward. It is to understand that his philosophy is born not from abstraction, but from the experience of one who witnessed intrigues, persecutions, and the violence of an empire that could erase a life with a simple decree. This practical and realistic dimension of his work explains why so many, in moments of crisis, turn to him in search of clarity and serenity. For Seneca, living well was not an unattainable ideal but a daily discipline, a posture toward the inevitable challenges of life. Therefore, when we ask, who was Seneca and why does he still matter? The answer goes far beyond the biography of a Roman philosopher. He matters because he reminds us that philosophy should not be an academic discourse, distant from reality, but a compass to navigate difficult times. He matters because he challenges us to reflect on what we are doing with our time, on how we deal with money, on the relationship we have with death, and on the value we give to friendship. And he matters because, in a world where we are bombarded with promises of instant happiness, Seneca calls us back to the essential. Life is brief, and it will only have meaning if we know how to manage it with wisdom, courage, and detachment. To understand the importance of Seneca, and the strength of his ideas, it is essential to immerse ourselves in the setting in which he lived. He was born in the year 4 before Christ, in a Rome that was no longer the austere republic of ancient generals and senators, but the heart of a colossal empire, ruled by Augustus, the first Roman emperor. This period inaugurated a new balance between power and philosophy, between military glory and politics, and at the same time, an environment of constant tension, where the life of a citizen could radically change at the whim of palace intrigues. Rome was, on the one hand, the center of a civilization marked by monumental architecture, luxury, and territorial expansion. On the other, it was an arena of bloody disputes, conspiracies, and summary executions. In this unstable setting, the great Stoic thinkers flourished, seeking to offer humanity a way to live well, even in the face of chaos. The Roman Empire at that time was consolidating itself as the most influential power in the known world. Its frontiers extended from Hispania to Syria, from the cold lands of Britannia to the deserts of Egypt. Rome was a city of contrasts. While the upper classes flaunted banquets, luxurious houses, and public games, the plebeians survived in precarious conditions, depending on bread and circuses, to forget their daily hardships. Social inequality was glaring, and political corruption corroded institutions. In this environment, philosophy was not a simple intellectual exercise, but a necessity for emotional survival. Stoicism spread as an antidote to human suffering, teaching that true freedom did not lie in wealth or power, but in inner mastery, in the control of passions, and in the acceptance of fate. Seneca grew up immersed in this contrast. His father, known as Seneca the Elder, was a renowned orator and writer, which guaranteed him access to education and to the cultural elite of the time. From an early age, young Seneca was exposed both to the splendor of Roman culture and to the instability of imperial politics. He saw firsthand how influential men could fall into disgrace overnight, how power rested on fragile alliances, and how the relentless pursuit of wealth and prestige often led to ruin. It is no coincidence that much of his writing is imbued with a critical view of the futility of material goods and the need to seek a stronger inner foundation. Beyond political and military life, Rome was also a cultural and philosophical melting pot. With its conquests, the empire absorbed traditions from Greece, Egypt, Asia Minor, and other peoples. This created a fertile environment for the flourishing of diverse philosophical schools. Among them, Stoicism stood out, bringing the idea that virtue is the only true good and that destiny must be accepted with serenity. It was within this context that Seneca found his voice, reinterpreting the Greek principles of Zeno of Citium, Cleanthes, and Chrysippus to adapt them to Roman reality. Unlike abstract idealism, his philosophy spoke directly to the practical life of men and women who had to deal with losses, betrayals, injustices, and above all the constant uncertainty of existence. The historical context also shaped the paradox of his own life. Rome offered unimaginable riches to those close to power, but it also demanded dangerous loyalties. The Senate, once a pillar of the Republic, had become a weakened institution, submissive to the emperor. Political life revolved around the court, where emperors such as Caligula, Claudius, and later Nero ruled amid excesses and arbitrariness. In this environment, being a philosopher did not mean living isolated from the world, but trying to survive within it, often through painful compromises. Seneca, in becoming an imperial advisor, embodied this dilemma, for while he counseled Nero on the basis of ideals of virtue, he also benefited from the wealth and privileges that this position provided him. This contrast is what makes Seneca's philosophy so authentic. He did not speak from within an ivory tower, removed from reality, but from within the very machinery of power, where each decision could cost him his life. He knew exile, glory, wealth, and the constant threat of execution. When he wrote about how to live well and how not to fear death, Seneca was not speculating theoretically, but speaking from concrete experience, from the perspective of one who lived in a time when life was fragile and subject to abrupt change. Rome, with all its grandeur and brutality, was the perfect stage to forge a philosophy that, instead of promising the elimination of suffering, taught how to endure it with dignity. Thus, understanding the historical context of Seneca is essential to valuing his work. He flourished in an era in which the empire offered all the pleasures of the world, but also all its threats. It was in this contradictory space that his philosophy found fertile ground, bringing a call to look inward, to cultivate virtue, and to learn to live wisely in the face of inevitable death. Rome was his stage, but the human drama he described is universal and timeless, which explains why his ideas continue to resonate today in a world that, although different in appearance, remains as unstable as the one he knew. Seneca's political life was marked by radical contrasts, in which the steadfast Stoic had to coexist with the astute courtier, the emperor's advisor had to negotiate with his own conscience, and the philosopher who preached detachment ended up entangled in plots of wealth and power. To understand his philosophy, it is impossible to separate the man from the environment in which he lived. What for some critics is proof of hypocrisy, for others represents the essence of his greatness. Seneca was able to reflect on the meaning of life not from academic abstraction, but from within the very epicenter of the most ruthless power in the world. Thus, his philosophy became a testimony not only of ideas but of survival. From an early age, Seneca demonstrated talent for oratory and philosophical thought. Educated in Rome, he quickly stood out among the youth of the elite, cultivating friendships that would lead him into political circles. He became a senator while still relatively young, but his career would not be marked only by ascension. The empire, under the rule of Caligula, was unstable, and Seneca soon became a target of envy and suspicion. The rhetorical ability that made him stand out also drew the attention of the powerful, and the emperor, fearing his influence, even considered his execution. He was spared, but from then on, carried the mark of someone who lived on unstable ground, where any word could cost a life. His trajectory suffered an even harsher blow under the rule of Claudius. Accused of having improper relations with the young Julia, the emperor's niece, Seneca was sentenced to exile in Corsica. This period of separation from the center of Rome, which lasted nearly 10 years, would be fundamental to his intellectual production. Isolated, he wrote texts reflecting on the brevity of life, on the value of philosophy as a guide, and on how adversity could be transformed into a teacher. For him, exile was not merely a punishment, but a laboratory of applied Stoicism, an experience that allowed him to practice what he preached, to accept fate, and to seek inner freedom, even when all external conditions seemed unfavorable. Seneca's return to Rome came in a surprising way. Agrippina, mother of Nero and wife of Claudius, recognized in the philosopher a figure capable of educating and guiding the young heir to the throne. Thus Seneca became Nero's tutor, one of the most dangerous and, at the same time, most influential positions in the empire. His mission was twofold: to instruct the future emperor in the arts of rhetoric and philosophy, and at the same time to attempt to mold his character. During the first years of Nero's reign, Seneca's positive influence is evident. The young ruler showed moderation, governed with prudence, and avoided the excesses that would later mark his reputation. This period became known as the golden years of Nero's government, thanks largely to the guidance of the philosopher and of Burrus, commander of the Praetorian Guard. However, the balance was fragile. The imperial court was a space of constant intrigue, and over time Nero began to distance himself from his tutor's counsel of moderation. The pressures of youth, the desire for absolute power, and the influence of more ambitious figures caused Nero to grow suspicious of Seneca. Even so, the philosopher remained by his side, trying to balance his position between loyalty to the emperor and fidelity to his principles. In the process, he accumulated a considerable fortune, the result of imperial donations and privileges, which earned him severe criticism from contemporaries and later generations, who saw in it a contradiction between his discourse of detachment and his life surrounded by material possessions. As Nero became increasingly tyrannical, Seneca's position became unsustainable. His counsels of virtue were no longer heard, and the emperor plunged into acts of violence and extravagance. Realizing that he could no longer exert influence over the government, Seneca asked to withdraw from political life and retire to a quieter existence, dedicated to philosophy. Withdrawal, however, did not free him from suspicion. His name ended up linked to the so-called Pisonian conspiracy, a plot to assassinate Nero. Although there is no evidence of his direct participation, the mere accusation was enough for him to be condemned to death. The way Seneca faced his condemnation would become one of the most emblematic moments of his life. Forced to take his own life, he calmly opened his veins, in an act that Roman historians transformed into an example of Stoicism lived to its ultimate consequences. His death was not only a personal tragedy, but also the consecration of his philosophy. In the face of violence and the arbitrariness of power, he demonstrated that the only true domain is that over one's own soul. Thus, Seneca's political life shows us that he was not only a thinker who reflected on virtue, time, and death, but also a man who had to negotiate daily with the contradictions between power and philosophy, surviving in an environment of instability and danger. If his path was marked by ambiguities, it is precisely within them that his relevance lies, for his philosophy was born from the harsh reality of an implacable empire and reaches us today as a practical guide for dealing with the eternal dilemmas of human existence. Among all of Seneca's works, none carry the same philosophical and existential weight as his famous Letters to Lucilius. They are more than simple correspondences. They constitute a true philosophical confession, a spiritual testament written by a man who knew he was close to death and wanted to leave the world the most practical and intimate compendium of Stoicism. Unlike formal treatises or public speeches, the letters have the power of closeness, of a personal tone, as if the philosopher were sitting in front of the reader, speaking calmly, in a low voice, about life, time, fear, wealth, and death. It is this intimacy that makes them, centuries later, still read as direct advice to each of us, as if there were no distance between Rome and the 21st century. Lucilius, the recipient of the letters, was a close friend of Seneca, also involved in the political and intellectual life of Rome. Although many details of his life remain obscure, what matters is the relationship of trust and sincerity that united them. Seneca treated him not only as a disciple, but as a companion on the journey, someone to whom he confessed his own weaknesses and doubts. This makes the letters even more human and powerful because the philosopher does not write from above, like an infallible master, but side by side like an experienced friend who offers his lessons without hiding his imperfections. It is in this gesture of humility that part of the strength of his work resides. The content of the letters is vast, ranging from reflections on the brevity of life to practical advice on how to deal with anger, loneliness, friendship, and death. In one of them, Seneca writes that we should not postpone life, as if always waiting for a tomorrow that never comes. He reminds Lucilius that each day lived is an entire life, which must be enjoyed with full attention, since death is not a distant future event, but something that has already begun. Part of us dies every day, he said, reminding him that lost time is time that can never be recovered. This notion of life as something that slips through our fingers if not well managed is one of Seneca's greatest contributions to thought. Another central theme of the letters is the use of philosophy as medicine for the soul. For him, philosophy was not a luxury reserved for scholars, but a necessity for all human beings. It was not enough to memorize principles or repeat maxims. It was necessary to apply philosophy to life, just as a doctor applies remedies to a sick body. Philosophy teaches us to act, not to speak, he affirmed, insisting that the true philosopher is the one who lives in accordance with what he teaches. This insistence on transforming wisdom into daily practice is what makes his letters so current, for they speak directly to contemporary dilemmas in which many accumulate knowledge without being able to transform it into concrete changes. In the letters, Seneca also deals with death with rare frankness. For him, death is not an evil, but simply the natural conclusion of life, something as inevitable as birth. The real problem is not dying, but living poorly, wasting time on futile concerns. This is why he advises Lucilius to face death head-on, without fear, reminding him that we have no power over when it will come, but we do have power over how we use the time until it arrives. This teaching, as simple as it is profound, resonates even more strongly in a modern world that avoids speaking about death, but lives in constant anguish before it. Wealth, another recurring theme in the letters, is approached from the perspective of detachment. Seneca, who was accused of accumulating great possessions during his life, did not fail to recognize the usefulness of money. However, he emphasized that true slavery arises when a man becomes possessed by wealth instead of possessing it. He advises Lucilius not to hate money, but to treat it as something secondary, which can be useful without ever becoming the central goal of life. This balanced vision contrasts both with the excesses of imperial Rome and with contemporary obsession with status and consumption. The tone of the letters is profoundly human. At various moments, Seneca shows himself vulnerable, acknowledging his own flaws and admitting that he does not fully live according to the principles he defends. This radical honesty, far from weakening his message, strengthens it, because it shows that even the wisest philosophers struggle against their weaknesses and contradictions. This aspect is crucial to understanding why his letters are not only philosophical texts, but true manuals of life, because in them Seneca does not speak as an idealized being, but as a real man who suffers, fears, and errs, but who seeks to learn each day. In summary, the letters to Lucilius are an invitation to personal reflection and the constant practice of philosophy. They are a mirror in which each generation can look at itself and recognize its own restlessness. In writing them, Seneca did not intend merely to leave a literary legacy, but to offer the world a practical guide to living with dignity and serenity in the face of the inevitable passage of time. For this reason, they are considered the philosophical testament of Stoicism, and perhaps the most intimate and enduring work that ancient Rome has left us. Few thinkers in history have reflected on time with as much clarity and intensity as Seneca. For him, true wealth did not lie in material possessions or political power, but in the proper management of time, that invisible and relentless resource that we all receive in limited quantity. In his work, On the Shortness of Life, he presents one of the most powerful ideas in all of ancient philosophy. Life is not short, but we make it short, because we waste it on futile occupations, useless worries, and endless desires. This statement is a direct blow against the way of living both in imperial Rome and in the modern world. Instead of caring for the most precious good we possess, we allow it to be lost in distractions and ambitions that lead us nowhere. Seneca reminds us that time is the only resource truly ours, yet also the only one we generously give away to others without realizing it. He harshly criticizes those who are vigilant with their possessions, who defend their property tooth and nail, but who waste entire years serving the interests of others, flattering superiors or chasing after fleeting honors. No one is as generous with their money as they are with their time, he observes, highlighting the irony of how we treat the scarcest resource as if it were infinite. This perception, valid already in the 1st century, becomes even more urgent in the contemporary era, where millions of people spend countless hours in front of screens, preoccupied with the lives of others while neglecting their own. The philosopher also warns against the danger of always living in the future, postponing life for a tomorrow that never comes. Many, he said, waste the present planning for the future, as if real life were always ahead, in a goal not yet achieved. This way of living generates frustration, since each passing day is treated as mere preparation for an ideal that may never materialize. Seneca insists that life must be lived in the now, because the present is the only reality over which we have control. The future belongs to fate, the past is gone, and only the present moment can be managed with wisdom. This awareness, if applied practically, transforms the way we approach daily tasks, relationships, and even rest. In his reflections, time is not just a chronological measure, but a space of spiritual opportunity. For Seneca, philosophy was the art of making good use of time, filling it with what truly matters, the cultivation of virtue, the pursuit of knowledge, and the practice of serenity. He did not propose a life of empty idleness, but of productive leisure, where the mind is dedicated to what enriches the soul instead of being lost in trivial concerns. At this point, he directly contrasts with the Roman elite, who saw free time only as an opportunity for extravagance, games, and banquets. Seneca offers an alternative, to transform time into spiritual investment rather than waste. The issue of time is also closely tied to how we view death. For the philosopher, we should not fear death, but rather the waste of life. The time we lose on frivolities is already a kind of living death, since it can never be recovered. In this sense, the fear of death dissolves when we understand that the only true tragedy is not having truly lived. Those who use time well do not fear the end, for they have already experienced life in its fullness. This teaching resounds as an urgent call in an era marked by haste and anxiety. In trying to do everything, we end up living nothing. Seneca also warns us about the false impression that we have much time available. He writes that many die without ever having begun to live. Routine, social obligations, the relentless pursuit of recognition, all of this consumes precious years without the person realizing that the clock never stops. This is one of the harshest, yet also most liberating pieces of advice in his philosophy. We only begin to truly live when we accept that time is finite. The awareness of finitude should not generate despair, but wisdom. It is what teaches us to choose our commitments better, to value our relationships, and to cultivate experiences that truly matter. Seneca's thought on time remains current because it speaks directly to the core of modern life. In a world where overwork, consumerism, and digital distractions hijack our attention, his warning sounds like prophecy. We are so busy living outward, trying to meet external expectations, that we forget to live inward, to care for that which no material loss can destroy, our own consciousness. In this sense, Seneca's philosophy of time is not just an ancient lesson, but a practical survival manual for contemporary civilization. Thus, when he writes to Lucilius about the brevity of life, he is not merely offering a reflection, but a call to action. He invites us to look at the clock of existence and ask, what have I done with the days that are gone? What am I doing with the present that remains to me? And above all, am I living in a dignified way, or merely letting time slip through my fingers? These questions, which echoed in the streets of Rome 2,000 years ago, continue to echo in each of us today, reminding us that true wisdom lies not in living long, but in living well. Among all of Seneca's legacies, perhaps none is as profound and unsettling as his reflections on life and death. He does not separate one from the other. For him, to learn to live is, at the same time, to learn to die. This is the essence of Stoicism in its most practical and radical form. Unlike a culture that fled from death and hid it behind festivals and spectacles, Seneca forces us to look directly at finitude, not as a threat, but as an integral part of life itself. All of life is an exercise in dying, he wrote in one of his letters, reminding us that each passing day is an inevitable approach to the end. This vision, far from plunging us into sadness, is a liberation, because it shows us that by accepting death, we free ourselves from the fear that paralyzes, and we learn to value the present intensely. The art of living, for Seneca, begins with the awareness that existence is brief and uncertain. He criticizes those who believe that living is simply prolonging time, as if quantity were more important than quality. A long life, filled with useless worries, is no better than a short life lived with wisdom. This notion is a blow against the modern obsession with indefinitely prolonging days without caring to make them meaningful. What gives life its meaning is not the number of years, but the way we choose to fill them. A life well lived is one in which each moment is inhabited with presence, virtue, and serenity, rather than wasted on trivialities or postponed for an uncertain tomorrow. The art of dying, on the other hand, requires courage and acceptance. For Seneca, the fear of death is the most cruel prison of human beings, because it prevents us from living fully. Those who fear the end never rest, never enjoy the present, because they are always under the shadow of an inevitable threat. Philosophy, in this sense, does not serve to eliminate death, but to eliminate the fear of death. It teaches us to look at the end, not as a catastrophe, but as the natural conclusion of a cycle. Death is not an evil, for it was not an evil not to have been born, he affirmed. This perspective disarms the dread of the end and opens the way to serenity. This Stoic view becomes even more striking when we remember Seneca's own death. Condemned by Nero to take his own life, he faced the order with calm, opening his veins in front of friends and family, turning his death into a living lesson in Stoicism. It was not a cold spectacle, but a demonstration that his teachings were not empty words. He proved that philosophy must be lived to its ultimate consequences, including in the final moment. His death is one of the most remarkable scenes of ancient history, because it shows a man who not only spoke about the art of dying, but practiced it consciously and serenely. Another important aspect of his reflection is the link between life, death, and freedom. For Seneca, accepting death is the key to achieving inner freedom. The man who does not fear the end is invincible, because no external threat can subdue him. The slavery of fear disappears, and in its place arises a life of courage. That is why in his letters he advises Lucilius to meditate on death daily, not as a morbid exercise but as training for liberation. The more aware we are of our finitude, the freer we become to live authentically. This philosophy also helps us confront suffering. Often the greater pain is not in death itself, but in its anticipation. The imagined terror, the projected fear, is often more paralyzing than the event itself. Seneca reminds us that much of our anguish is born from living the future ahead of time, as if we were dying 1,000 times before dying once in reality. Stoicism teaches us to break this cycle of anxiety, bringing the mind back to the present and cultivating serenity that allows us to face both good days and bad with balance. In the contemporary world, where death is avoided in conversation, hidden away in hospitals, and feared as a taboo, Seneca's message is all the more necessary. He invites us to restore life to its true measure, reminding us that living is a conscious exercise, and dying is only the natural conclusion of that exercise. There is no meaning in wasting years trying to escape the inevitable. There is meaning, however, in spending each day as if it were complete in itself, cultivating virtue, friendship, and serenity. This is the true art of living, to see death as a constant companion, and precisely because of that, to learn to value life in all its intensity. Therefore, in uniting the art of living with the art of dying, Seneca offers us an integral philosophy that does not separate theory from practice. His life and death are testimonies that wisdom is not merely a discourse, but a way of existing. Whoever learns to live without fear of death gains not only serenity, but a freedom that no tyranny, wealth, or misfortune can destroy. This is the inheritance the Roman philosopher left humanity, a call to live fully and to die with dignity, as if both acts were faces of the same coin. Few points in Seneca's philosophy generate as much controversy as his relationship with wealth. He wrote memorable pages about the danger of becoming a slave to money, about the importance of moderation, and about the need to cultivate detachment, but at the same time, he was one of the richest men of his time. This apparent contradiction has led many critics, both ancient and modern, to accuse him of hypocrisy. How can a philosopher who preaches simplicity accumulate fortune and live surrounded by privileges? The answer is not simple, but it reveals the depth of his philosophy. For Seneca, it is not possession itself that enslaves man, but attachment. The problem does not lie in being rich, but in living as if wealth were the only value of existence. In several letters and treatises, Seneca affirms that money should be seen as an instrument, never as an end. It can make life easier, provide comfort and security, but it cannot be confused with true happiness. It is not the man who has little who is poor, but the one who desires more, he wrote, overturning the common logic of Roman society and of ours, which measures a person's worth by the quantity of accumulated goods. This vision places wealth in its proper place, useful when well managed, but dangerous when it becomes an obsession. For him, true freedom lies in being able to live both with much and with little, without it shaking inner serenity. His practical position becomes clear when he advises Lucilius not to flee from wealth, but to remain vigilant regarding it. He does not defend that all should give up material goods and live in extreme poverty, as certain philosophical or religious currents might do. On the contrary, he recognizes the value of abundance, provided it does not corrupt character or divert attention from what truly matters. The wise man can use wealth without being used by it. He can enjoy possessions, but does not depend on them to live in peace. This balanced vision is what distinguishes Seneca from many moralists. He does not condemn money, but servitude to money. It is also important to remember that, in the context of Rome, wealth was inseparable from political life. As Nero's advisor, Seneca received privileges, donations, and properties that increased his fortune. To refuse such rewards would have been practically impossible without losing influence or even putting his own life at risk. In this sense, his wealth must be understood not only as a personal choice, but as a consequence of his social and political position. Nevertheless, even in that scenario, he sought to make it clear that he did not see himself as dependent on gold and silver. His philosophy constantly reaffirmed that the only true possession was virtue. The contrast between his discourse and his fortune, far from weakening his message, makes it even more relevant. After all, who among us does not live caught in similar contradictions? We preach the importance of time, but lose ourselves in distractions. We value health, but give in to vices. We talk about simplicity, but but long for abundance. Seneca, with his paradoxical life, is not an example of perfection but of humanity. He shows that even those who reflect on wisdom are not immune to the pressures of the world, and that the greater challenge is precisely to balance thought and practice. In this sense, his example should not be seen as a failure, but as a demonstration that philosophy is a constant exercise, never concluded. In his writings, Seneca also warns of the danger of luxury and ostentation. He recognized that the insatiable desire for material goods creates a life of eternal dependence, in which nothing is enough and everything seems too little. He who has much desires more, he wrote, denouncing the psychological trap of abundance. The solution was not to reject comfort, but to learn to enjoy it without being lost in it. This lesson is especially valuable in the modern world, where advertising and consumer culture push us into an endless race for more money, more objects, more status. Against this, Seneca offers the serenity of one who knows that happiness is not outside but within. Wealth, for him, should be tested with the discipline of detachment. In some letters, he advises the practice of living temporarily with less, sleeping on a hard bed, eating simple foods, wearing cheap clothes, to prove to oneself that luxury is not necessary for survival. This exercise not only strengthens the soul, but frees one from the fear of loss. He who becomes accustomed to living with little never fears losing much. This is a lesson of courage and freedom. True security does not lie in accumulating, but in knowing that one can live well even in the absence of abundance. Therefore, when we think of Seneca and his philosophy of wealth, we should not see merely a man who accumulated possessions, but a philosopher who deeply understood the fragility of human belongings. His message is not of absolute renunciation, nor of glorification of poverty, but of balance and detachment. He teaches us that we can have money without being enslaved by it, that we can enjoy comfort without becoming its hostage. This is the key to transforming wealth into a servant, and not a master. Seneca saw pain and suffering not as accidents of life, but as inevitable elements of the human condition. For him, fleeing from pain is as useless as trying to escape death, because both belong to the natural order of the world. What differentiates the wise man from the ignorant is not the absence of suffering, but the way one deals with it. In his letters and treatises, Seneca insists that pain can be endured with dignity and even transformed into an opportunity for growth, provided that the mind is prepared to accept it. This teaching, harsh and realistic, is one of the central points of his philosophy, because it shows us that serenity does not arise from the absence of difficulties, but from the ability to face them. He claimed that much of human suffering does not come from the events themselves, but from the way we interpret them. The body may feel pain, but it is the mind that amplifies this discomfort by adding fear, anger, and despair. In this sense, physical suffering is limited, but psychological suffering is infinite when fueled by anxious thoughts. Man suffers more in imagination than in reality, Seneca said, in a phrase that still echoes today. This distinction between real pain and imagined pain is liberating, because it shows us that we can lessen much of the weight of suffering if we learn to control our judgments and discipline our mind. Acceptance of destiny or fatum also occupies a central place in his thought. For Seneca, the universe is governed by a rational order, and everything that happens is part of this order, even what we consider unjust or cruel. Resisting this reality is like fighting against a current. The more we resist, the more we suffer. Wisdom consists of accepting what cannot be changed and using reason to act in the best way within the circumstances. This does not mean passivity, but lucidity, recognizing that there are things beyond our control and that spending energy against them is a waste of life. Thus, he invites us to cultivate an attitude of serenity toward what escapes our will. This thought appears in his reflections on illnesses and adversities. He reminded Lucilius that even the healthiest body is subject to diseases, accidents, and frailties, and that we should not expect a life free of pain. What we can do, however, is choose how we react when pain appears. A man trained in philosophy faces pain not as an injustice, but as a test of character. By accepting it, he shows courage. By enduring it, he strengthens his soul. By learning from it, he finds freedom. This transformation of pain into a teacher is one of the great contributions of Stoicism, and Seneca expressed it with clarity and force. In his life, Seneca experienced many forms of suffering. He lived in exile, faced political persecution, was unjustly accused, lost friends, and finally had to face a death ordered by his own disciple, Nero. In all these circumstances, he applied the philosophy he defended. When sent to Corsica, he wrote texts on how the mind can adapt to any place and transform even isolation into an opportunity for study. When facing the order of suicide, he turned tragedy into an act of serenity. His life, therefore, is testimony that suffering can be endured without despair when one has a solid philosophical foundation. In the modern world, his ideas about pain and destiny continue to offer comfort. We live in a society that tries to eliminate any discomfort, whether physical or emotional, but at the same time seems more distressed than ever. By denying pain, we create even more suffering, because every difficulty becomes unbearable. Seneca teaches us to change our perspective. Instead of fighting against the existence of pain, we must learn to live with it. This does not mean refusing remedies or solutions, but cultivating a mind capable of remaining serene even when healing does not come. This attitude gives us resilience and allows us to go through crises without losing dignity. He also warns against the temptation to blame destiny. Many times we spend life asking, "Why me?" as if pain were an injustice aimed personally at us. For Seneca, this view is illusory, because everyone suffers in some way. Adversity is universal, and destiny does not choose favorites. The difference lies in how each one responds. The wise man accepts destiny as part of the great fabric of life, and by doing so, finds a peace that the ignorant will never achieve. This acceptance does not eliminate pain, but it eliminates the despair that accompanies it, transforming suffering into a natural part of the journey. Thus, Seneca's philosophy on pain, suffering, and destiny is a call to courage. He challenges us to abandon the illusion of a life without difficulties and to embrace reality as it is. By accepting the inevitable, we cease to be prisoners of fear and become masters of our own soul. This is the true victory of the Stoic, not to conquer the external world, but to conquer oneself. For Seneca, friendship was one of the greatest goods in life, an essential bond between men, but one that could only be true when rooted in virtue. He rejected the idea of friendship based on interests, favors, or conveniences, since such ties cannot withstand the test of time or adversity. He who begins to be your friend because of what you have ceases to be your friend when you lose it, he wrote, reminding us that superficial friendships are nothing more than disguised commercial associations. True friendship, according to him, is that which is born from admiration for virtue and sustained by mutual loyalty, regardless of external circumstances. This elevated conception of friendship was not merely theoretical, but practical. In his letters to Lucilius, Seneca does not limit himself to offering philosophical advice. He opens up, shares his weaknesses, exposes doubts and fears. This sincerity demonstrates that he believed in the power of friendship as a space for moral growth. A friend is not only a companion, but a mirror that reflects our flaws and virtues. Through him, we learn to know ourselves better. Seneca advised Lucilius to cultivate few friends, but with absolute trust, for to him one true friend was worth more than 1,000 superficial relations. Virtue, in this context, is the cement of friendship. As a true Stoic, Seneca saw virtue as the supreme good, the only wealth that no one could take from us. Thus, a bond based on virtue is unshakable because it does not depend on money, social status, or fleeting interests. Such a friendship does not fear losses, nor does it waver in adversity, because it is supported by what is eternal, character. This idea resonated strongly in his time, marked by fragile political alliances and constant betrayals, but it also applies to our era, where many relationships dissolve at the first sign of difficulty. Seneca also saw in friendship an opportunity to live philosophy in practice. He stated that the wise man does not need friends to be happy, since his happiness lies within his own soul. However, the wise man seeks friendship because he desires to share his life, his learnings, and his serenity with others. Friendship, therefore, is not a necessity but a noble choice, a gift of life that further enriches existence. This balance between self-sufficiency and openness to others is one of the deepest marks of his Stoic vision. Another important point is trust. For Seneca, friendship requires total surrender. He advised not to trust many, but once a friend is chosen, to give oneself without reservations. This was not naivety, but moral courage. To live distrusting everyone is to live in solitude. A true friend is one to whom life itself can be entrusted, because his loyalty does not falter. This absolute trust is rare, but when found, it is the greatest treasure one can possess. At the same time, Seneca reminded that friendship is not made only of pleasure and comfort, but also of correction. A true friend is one who has the courage to criticize us, to show us our mistakes, and to help us improve. In his letters, he insists that we should not seek friends who only please us, but those who have the courage to tell us the truth. This vision opposed the culture of flattery that dominated the Roman court and remains relevant today, in a society where many prefer empty applause to sincere advice. His philosophy of friendship also reveals the political dimension of his thought. In a Rome marked by betrayals and conspiracies, where alliances were broken out of interest, the idea of virtuous friendship was almost revolutionary. It represented a moral resistance against the corruption of human ties. By defending friendship based on virtue, Seneca offered a model of relationship that could serve as a refuge against the instability of power and social intrigues. Today, his reflections on friendship continue to challenge us. We live in a hyper-connected world, but one lacking in deep bonds. Many accumulate hundreds of virtual contacts but lack a single true friend. Seneca reminds us that friendship is not measured in quantity, but in quality, and that its value lies in offering trust, loyalty, and virtue. His teaching invites us to look at our own relationships and ask, are we surrounded by companions who merely entertain us, or by friends who truly strengthen us? Therefore, under Seneca's Stoic lens, friendship is much more than an emotional bond. It is a moral exercise, a pact of virtue, a space for mutual growth. It does not eliminate the solitude of the wise man, but transforms it into a choice. It does not guarantee a life without pain, but it offers a firm shoulder amid storms. It is ultimately one of the greatest gifts that life can offer, as long as it is sought and cultivated with authenticity. Few philosophers lived with such intensity the dilemma between public life and inner life as Seneca did. As counselor, courtier, and senator, he was immersed in the power games of imperial Rome. As a Stoic philosopher, he advocated retreat, self-mastery, and inner serenity. This tension permeates his entire work and life, revealing how the exercise of philosophy does not take place in an ideal vacuum, but amidst the concrete pressures of the world. Seneca is not the isolated hermit, writing far from temptations and conflicts. He is the thinker, striving to balance the demands of politics with the needs of the soul. This contrast, which already intrigued his contemporaries, is precisely what gives strength to his philosophy even today. For the dilemma of reconciling work, social obligations, and the search for inner peace remains a reality for all of us. For Seneca, philosophy was a refuge from the brutality of public life. In his letters, he described how Roman politics was impregnated with intrigues, betrayals, and instability, making the existence of public men a constant risk. The Senate no longer held the same power as before, and the emperor's will prevailed over any decision. In this scenario, he was forced to live among ambitious figures, hungry for power and wealth, who lived to please the ruler. Philosophy for him was the antidote to such corruption, the force that reminded him daily that behind all glory and disgrace, the only thing truly ours was the government of ourselves. However, Seneca never preached absolute isolation from the world. Unlike some philosophers who saw public life as a trap to be avoided, he recognized that political engagement could be necessary and even virtuous, as long as it did not compromise moral integrity. This stance reveals his practical vision. The wise man does not need to flee society to maintain peace, but must learn to preserve it even amid turmoil. It is not the place that brings tranquility, but the tranquil mind that makes any place bearable, he wrote, indicating that serenity does not depend on the environment, but on inner discipline. His own life, however, showed the weight of this balance. As tutor and counselor to Nero, Seneca held a position of great influence. During the first years of the emperor's reign, his philosophy contributed to a moderate and relatively just administration, a period known as Nero's golden years. But over time, as Nero leaned toward tyranny and excess, Seneca found himself facing an impossible choice: remain at the emperor's side and in some way condone his abuses, or step away and lose any possibility of influence. His gradual withdrawal from political life reflects the difficulty of reconciling power and philosophy, showing that even the most disciplined of Stoics is not immune to the dilemmas of the real world. The philosopher also warned against the illusion that power brings freedom. On the contrary, he said, power makes men more enslaved to the expectations of others. The ruler, the senator, the courtier, all live to please or fear others, always dependent on external approval. The truly free man, according to Seneca, is the one who governs himself. In this sense, inner life surpasses public life. Only those who conquer themselves can perform any role in society without being lost in it. This inversion of values is revolutionary because it dismantles the Roman logic that public prestige was the supreme measure of greatness. This teaching resonates deeply in our time. We live in an era in which public life, even if not political but social, occupies much of our concerns. Social networks, competitive work, and the pursuit of recognition push us outward, onto a stage where we constantly play roles in search of approval. Seneca reminds us that if we do not cultivate inner life, we end up as prisoners of this theater. Philosophy thus becomes a way to maintain integrity amid exposure, a way to protect essence against external pressures. Thus, the balance between power and philosophy in Seneca is not merely an ancient matter but a permanent lesson. He teaches us that it is possible to be in the world without losing oneself in it, to participate in public life without letting it destroy inner serenity. This balance requires constant vigilance, mental discipline, and the courage to say no when necessary. Seneca's life shows that this path is not easy and that contradictions are inevitable. But it is precisely in the attempt to live this tension that a living, practical, and human philosophy emerges, capable of traversing centuries and still offering answers to the most urgent dilemmas of existence. The relationship between Seneca and Nero is one of the most dramatic and paradoxical episodes in Roman history, for it brings face to face the Stoic philosopher, defender of virtue and moderation, and the young emperor who would become synonymous with tyranny and excess. This bond, which began as an attempt to shape a wise ruler, ended up as a dark portrait of the limits of philosophy before the corruption of absolute power. It is also an example of the eternal tension between master and disciple, where the desire to guide clashes with the untamable nature of one who holds unlimited authority. When Agrippina, Nero's mother, brought Seneca back from exile and entrusted him with educating her son, there was a clear expectation. The philosopher should not only instruct the young man in rhetoric and philosophy, but also mold his character. The task was immense, for Nero already showed violent and capricious impulses. Still, during the early years of his reign, Seneca's influence was visible. The young emperor adopted a moderate stance, governing prudently and avoiding the abuses that would later mark his reputation. This initial period became known as the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 golden years of Nero, and many historians attribute this balance to Seneca's guidance and the support of Burrus, head of the Praetorian Guard. However, Nero's nature and the pressures of the court gradually suffocated this moderation. The emperor began to distance himself from his master's advice, drawn to pleasures, extravagances, and the desire to wield absolute power without restrictions. Episodes such as the murder of his own mother, Agrippina, and later of his wife Poppaea, demonstrate the complete collapse of any moral influence. For Seneca, this transformation represented not only personal frustration, but an existential dilemma. To what extent should he remain at Nero's side, trying to restrain him, and to what extent was he becoming complicit in his tyranny by remaining silent? This relationship exposed the limits of philosophy before the reality of imperial power. However much Seneca wrote about virtue and moderation, he faced a ruler unwilling to be guided by rational counsel. The philosopher tried several times to withdraw from political life, asking permission to retire in peace, but Nero hesitated to release him. This game of dependence and mistrust corroded their bond. Nero knew that Seneca still held influence and prestige, and feared that his departure from court could strengthen him as an opponent. Seneca, in turn, knew that his presence exposed him to accusations of hypocrisy and made him a hostage to the emperor's arbitrariness. Over time, the distance between master and disciple became irreversible. Seneca increasingly wrote about the importance of inner life, serenity in the face of external injustices, and preparation for death, revealing that he no longer nurtured hopes of reforming the emperor. His philosophy became a refuge, a spiritual fortress against the political decay he witnessed up close. Still, he could not escape his fate. Accused of involvement in the Pisonian conspiracy against Nero, he was condemned to take his own life. This dramatic moment sealed the end of their relationship and became a symbol of the tragedy of their bond. The contrast between master and disciple is of enormous historical and philosophical value. It shows that not even the most refined wisdom can fully transform the nature of one who surrenders to power and vice. At the same time, it reveals the fragility of philosophers when placed in political contexts dominated by tyranny. Seneca was unable to save Nero from himself, but he left a powerful testimony on how to face ruin with dignity. His serene death, in contrast with the emperor's violence, symbolizes the victory of philosophy over the corruption of power. Today, the story of Seneca and Nero still echoes as a warning. It shows the limits of education and philosophy when absolute power meets an unrestrained character, while at the same time highlighting the importance of preserving integrity even amid decay. The drama of master and disciple remains a reminder that philosophy cannot guarantee the transformation of others, but it can guarantee the serenity of those who practice it to the end. Over the centuries, Seneca has been the target of countless criticisms that revolve around a central dilemma. Was he a hypocrite, incapable of living what he preached, or a realist, aware that even philosophers are bound by historical and social circumstances? This debate has accompanied his figure from antiquity to the present day and continues to fuel divergent interpretations of his legacy. The controversy arises mainly from the tension between his philosophy, which exalts simplicity, detachment, and serenity, and his practical life, marked by wealth, political influence, and proximity to Nero, one of the cruelest emperors in Roman history. His contemporaries already saw a contradiction between the philosopher and the courtier. Tacitus, the great Roman historian, recorded both the brilliance of his eloquence and the ambiguities of his public life. On the one hand, he was celebrated as one of the greatest intellectuals of his time, a master of writing and Stoic philosophy. On the other hand, he was criticized for amassing wealth while writing about contempt for material possessions. This duplicity fueled the image of a man who preached one thing and lived another, reinforcing the accusation of hypocrisy. The question, however, is more complex than it seems. Seneca did not deny his own flaws. In his letters, he frequently acknowledges that he is still in the process of learning, and that he does not fully live up to Stoic ideals. This acknowledgement is, in itself, an act of humility that contrasts with the idea of hypocrisy. He did not present himself as a perfect model, but as a man in struggle, seeking to align his life with his philosophy. In this sense, his contradictions do not diminish his message, but make it more human and closer to us, because they show that even great sages face dilemmas and weaknesses. Another frequent criticism falls on his relationship with Nero. Many accuse Seneca of having been complicit in the emperor's abuses, since he remained in his circle of advisors, even when it became clear that Nero had become a tyrant. In fact, it is difficult to ignore the weight of this bond. However, it must be remembered that political life in Rome was marked by fragile alliances and constant dangers. Refusing to serve the emperor could mean immediate death. Furthermore, in the early years of his reign, his presence helped contain Nero's excesses, ensuring a period of relative stability. His continued presence at the emperor's side can be seen not only as complicity, but also as a desperate attempt to save what could still be saved. In the field of wealth, criticism was also intense. Seneca amassed a considerable fortune, something that seemed incompatible with his discourse of detachment. However, his philosophy never preached absolute renunciation of goods, but rather freedom from them. He did not condemn the use of wealth but the attachment to it. It is possible, therefore, that he considered his fortune an inevitable resource of his political position, but not an end in itself. This distinction is fundamental to understanding his stance. It is not about radical asceticism, but about balance between enjoying what life offers and not depending on it to be happy. Furthermore, it must be emphasized that his work survives precisely because it was written in the midst of the contradictions of his life. If he had completely isolated himself from politics and wealth, he might not have produced reflections as realistic and applicable. His experiences, although controversial, gave him authority to speak about the dilemmas of existence. He knew from his own experience how difficult it is to maintain serenity in a world full of temptations and pressures. In this sense, his philosophy is more practical than theoretical. It arises from lived life, not from an unattainable ideal. Modern critics remain divided. Some insist on seeing him as a hypocrite who used philosophy as a facade to justify his comfortable life. Others, however, see him as a profoundly lucid figure, capable of recognizing human flaws and offering possible, albeit imperfect, paths to a better life. This second reading brings him closer to us because it reminds us that philosophy is not a demand for perfection, but a continuous exercise of improvement. Therefore, the question, was Seneca a hypocrite or a realist, may not have a definitive answer. He was, above all, a man bound to his time, subject to the pressures of the court, political ambitions, and the temptations of wealth, but who never stopped reflecting on how to live with dignity amid all of this. His contradictions do not invalidate his philosophy. On the contrary, they make it more relevant, for they show that wisdom is not the absence of flaws, but the ability to face them with honesty and courage. Few episodes of antiquity so symbolically condense the union between life and philosophy as the death of Seneca. Condemned by Nero under the accusation of involvement in the Pisonian conspiracy, a plot that sought to overthrow the emperor, the philosopher was forced to choose the manner of his death. This moment, recorded by historians such as Tacitus, not only marked the end of his life, but also became a living example of Stoicism practiced to its ultimate consequences. His death was not merely the outcome of a political drama, but the definitive proof that his words on courage, serenity, and acceptance of destiny were not theoretical abstractions, but embodied convictions. When he received the order to take his own life, Seneca did not react with despair but with calm. He summoned his friends and family, consoled them in the face of tragedy, and exhorted them to remain steadfast. This posture reveals the essence of his philosophy. Death, inevitable for all, should not be feared, but accepted as the natural conclusion of existence. Instead of lamenting his fate, he expressed gratitude for the time he had had and serenity for what was to come. This gesture not only impressed his contemporaries, but remains a timeless testimony to the inner strength that Stoicism can generate. The account of his death shows that he opened his veins, a common practice in Roman executions, and faced physical pain with firmness. When death was slow in arriving, he requested poison and later entered a hot bath, showing serenity even in suffering. Each gesture was calculated to show that true mastery lies not over the body but over the soul. By controlling his attitude toward the inevitable, Seneca reaffirmed one of the central principles of Stoicism. We cannot control external events, but we can always control our response to them. This tragic moment is even more impactful when we recall his own words. For years, Seneca had written to Lucilius about the importance of preparing for death daily, of living each day as if it were complete in itself, without postponing life for the future. His own death was therefore confirmation that he had followed this discipline. By facing the end with courage, he showed that the Stoic does not merely reflect on life, but commits to living it coherently until the very last instant. This coherence is what distinguishes true philosophers from mere rhetoricians. The serenity of his death also implicitly exposed the contrast with Nero. While the disciple sank into paranoia, violence, and excess, the master took his leave with dignity and courage. This historical opposition reinforces the idea that true strength does not lie in the absolute power of the emperor, but in the inner peace of the philosopher. Nero could condemn Seneca's body, but he had no power over his soul. This is one of the most powerful messages his death transmitted to posterity. External domination is fragile and transitory, but internal mastery is inviolable. Throughout history, Seneca's death has been remembered as an example of philosophical integrity. Many later thinkers, from Montaigne to Pascal, saw in his attitude a model of how to face destiny with courage. For modern man, Accustomed to fleeing from death and hiding it behind hospitals and silences, his Serenity remains a radical lesson. He reminds us that death is not the opposite of life, but part of it, and that the fear of dying is the true enemy that prevents us from fully living. Thus, the death of Seneca should not be seen merely as a historical episode, but as the crowning of his philosophy. He lived amid contradictions, surrounded by wealth, power, and dangers, but in the end, he demonstrated that the essential remained intact, the ability to remain master of himself in the face of the inevitable. His final act was not just the end of a life, but the victory of philosophy over fear, a legacy that continues to inspire generations seeking to live and die with dignity. The influence of Seneca transcended the boundaries of imperial Rome and crossed centuries, shaping the way philosophers, writers, and thinkers reflected on life, death, and the human condition. His voice, preserved in the Letters to Lucilius, On the Shortness of Life, and other treatises, echoed especially in periods of cultural and spiritual crisis when the world sought answers in the face of the fragility of existence. Seneca's legacy is not only intellectual but also practical. He became a master of introspection, a guide on how to deal with time, pain, wealth, and mortality. For this reason, even after the fall of the Roman Empire, his ideas continued to be read, reinterpreted, and applied by thinkers who found in his philosophy a beacon for their own times. During the Middle Ages, although Stoicism was often overshadowed by Christianity, Seneca was read and quoted by various Christian authors. His ethics of detachment, his emphasis on virtue, and his serenity in the face of death resonated with the values of the Christian faith, leading some to consider him almost a pre-Christian in his moral wisdom. The apocryphal correspondence between Seneca and the Apostle Paul, despite lacking historical basis, demonstrates how strongly his figure was associated with spirituality and religious thought. This bridge with Christian morality helped preserve his work in monasteries and libraries, ensuring that his ideas survived until the Renaissance. It was in this period, especially in France, that Seneca once again shone brightly. Michel de Montaigne, in the 16th century, found in his letters an inexhaustible source of inspiration. The author of the Essays read Seneca not as a distant theorist, but as an intimate friend who offered practical advice. Montaigne admired his ability to speak of death without fear, to treat pain with realism, and to constantly remind that life is brief and must be lived with intensity. This reading deeply influenced the humanist tradition, establishing Seneca as one of the pillars of Renaissance European thought. In the 17th century, Blaise Pascal, the French thinker marked by religiosity and reflections on the human condition, also engaged with Seneca. Although he recognized the limits of Stoicism compared to the necessity of Christian grace, Pascal saw in the Roman philosopher an example of lucidity in confronting human misery and vanity. His criticism did not erase his admiration. For Pascal, Seneca proved that human reason could reach far in its search for meaning, even if it could not achieve the transcendence offered by faith. This dialogue shows how Seneca's philosophy remained relevant even in an era dominated by theology. In the centuries that followed, his influence did not wane. Enlightenment philosophers revisited his ideas on time and virtue as a counterpoint to the growing materialism. Romantic writers found in his reflections on pain and death a source of inspiration for their own restlessness. Even in modern times, among psychologists, therapists, and contemporary thinkers, Seneca continues to be cited as a reference for dealing with anxiety, haste, and existential anguish. His clarity in exposing human dilemmas makes him timeless, capable of speaking both to a Roman citizen of the 1st century and to a young person connected to social networks in the 21st century. This legacy shows that Seneca's philosophy is more than an ancient doctrine. It is a perennial exercise in humanity. He did not concern himself with creating complex systems or abstract theories, but with offering practical tools for living well. For this reason, his words cross cultural and religious boundaries, being adapted by Christians, humanists, Enlightenment thinkers, and moderns alike. In every era, he was reinterpreted according to the anxieties of the time, yet always preserving his essence. Life is brief, death is certain, and serenity is born of virtue. Thus, when we look at Seneca's heritage, we see more than a Roman philosopher. We see a universal master of the human condition, His voice resonated in Montaigne and Pascal, and in so many others because it touches the deepest core of existence. How to live well amid brevity, suffering, and uncertainty. This is why his thought did not die with him, but spread like an invisible thread that connects generations, helping each one face its dilemmas with courage and wisdom. The strength of Seneca's thought lies precisely in its timelessness. Although he wrote in the heart of the Roman Empire, his reflections resonate directly with the dilemmas of the 21st century. We live in an era marked by haste, by the overabundance of information, by the incessant pursuit of wealth, and by the constant fear of wasting time. In this context, Seneca becomes more relevant than ever, for he offers a practical philosophy capable of restoring serenity in the face of modern chaos. His voice, though separated by centuries, sounds uncannily close. He speaks of the brevity of life, of slavery to money, and of the need to accept death with courage, exactly the same issues that continue to afflict us today. One of the most urgent points of his philosophy is the use of time. Today, time seems to slip through our hands faster than ever. We are constantly busy, yet rarely present. We spend hours in front of screens, in endless meetings, in tasks that often lack real meaning. Seneca already warned that life is not short, but that we make it short by wasting it. This lesson, applied to our daily lives, invites us to rethink priorities. What are we doing with the hours we are given each day? Are we truly living, or merely postponing life in favor of an uncertain tomorrow? Seneca's teaching is clear. Happiness does not lie in prolonging the days, but in filling them with virtue and awareness. Another essential aspect is the relationship with wealth. In a world driven by consumerism and obsession with status, Seneca's reflections on money sound like an antidote. He reminded us that true poverty is not having little, but desiring more. This principle, if applied today, frees us from the endless race for material possessions and invites us to use wealth as a means, not an end. We may own things, but we must not be owned. We may enjoy them, but without becoming dependent. In a century where many live in debt or enslaved by the image of success, the lesson of detachment becomes a radical form of freedom. Serenity, perhaps, is Seneca's most valuable contribution to the 21st century. We live surrounded by stimuli, anxieties, and uncertainties. The recent pandemic revealed how fragile and unpredictable life can be, exposing our difficulty in facing death and loss. Seneca teaches us that serenity does not arise from the absence of problems, but from the ability to accept them and confront them with courage. He invites us to cultivate the mind as a refuge, to train the spirit daily to endure both joy and pain. This practice, applied amid modern turbulence, can restore the calm necessary to live meaningfully in an accelerated world. Seneca's letters also speak to contemporary psychological issues. When he says that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, he is describing the very mechanism we now call anxiety, the tendency to live future pains in advance. His proposal is clear. Bring the mind back to the present. Focus on the now, for it is the only dimension of life that truly belongs to us. This vision connects strikingly with modern practices, such as meditation and mindfulness, showing that Stoicism can be incorporated as a daily discipline to reduce anguish and increase mental clarity. In the field of relationships, Seneca also offers answers. In a hyper-connected yet lonely society, his reflections on friendship as a bond of virtue remind us that true connection does not lie in the number of contacts or likes, but in the quality of relationships. He invites us to seek solid ties based on trust and sincerity, and to abandon superficial relationships that merely drain time and energy. This lesson is especially powerful in a century where many measure their worth by the size of their social network, forgetting the depth of real bonds. Applying Seneca to the 21st century, therefore, is more than quoting his words on social networks. It is transforming his philosophy into a way of life. This means learning to say no to distractions, valuing silence, cultivating true friendship, facing death without fear, and treating money as a servant, never as a master. It is a call to recover the centrality of the soul in a world that scatters us outward. His wisdom is a reminder that a life well lived does not depend on technology, speed, or consumption, but on the ability to live each moment with awareness and dignity. Thus, in the 21st century, Seneca remains not only a Roman philosopher, but a universal counselor. His words have crossed empires, religions, and cultural revolutions, and they continue to offer answers to those seeking serenity amid the noise. He reminds us that the essential has not changed. Life is still brief, death is still certain, and true freedom is still the conquest of oneself. In this sense, applying his philosophy today is an act of resistance against haste, fear, and superficiality, and an invitation to live with courage, detachment, and serenity in the face of the inevitable brevity of existence. The presence of Seneca on YouTube, in podcasts, and in contemporary pop culture reveals the striking relevance of his philosophy. His quotes circulate in short motivational videos, in soundtracks accompanied by melancholic images, in social media posts, and even in tattoos inked on bodies around the world. What explains this phenomenon? The answer lies in the combination of clarity, universality, and emotional impact of his words. Unlike complex philosophers who demand long readings to be understood, Seneca wrote in a direct, simple, and practical manner. This accessibility makes his ideas perfect for the fast consumption of the digital age, without losing depth. One of the central factors of his virality is the almost personal tone of his letters to Lucilius. He does not speak as a distant master, but as an intimate friend, offering practical advice on how to deal with fear, pain, anxiety, and death. This epistolary style fits perfectly with the format of reflective videos that have become popular on digital platforms. It is as if every viewer were the new Lucilius, receiving timeless advice that seems written for the dilemmas of the 21st century. This direct identification creates closeness and makes Seneca appealing both to scholars and to young people who have never opened a philosophy book. Moreover, his central themes, time, the brevity of life, wealth, serenity, and death, are universal. They touch on the deepest human anxieties and therefore remain relevant regardless of the era. In a world where anxiety and depression have increased, and where the feeling of always being out of time dominates modern life, phrases such as, "It is not that we have little time, but that we waste much," gain an almost prophetic force. They sound like warnings and remedies at the same time, synthesizing in a few words reflections that can transform the way someone views their own life. Aesthetics also contribute to this phenomenon. On YouTube videos, the narration of Seneca's phrases often appears accompanied by nature images, soft instrumental music, and a slow cadence, creating a meditative atmosphere. This visual and auditory combination enhances the philosophical message and transforms the content into a sensory experience, capable of capturing the attention even of those who never cared about philosophy. In this sense, Seneca ends up becoming a kind of involuntary digital guru, his Stoicism functioning as a tool for emotional self-care for a generation seeking comfort amidst chaos. Another reason for his popularity is the compatibility of his philosophy with the discourse of self-help and personal performance. Stoicism, with its emphasis on controlling what depends on us and accepting the inevitable, fits perfectly into narratives of discipline, resilience, and focus. Many entrepreneurs, athletes, and influencers cite Seneca to motivate audiences to face challenges and overcome obstacles. This appropriation may, in some cases, oversimplify his ideas, but it also broadens his reach, taking his philosophy to audiences who might never have encountered it in its original form. However, Seneca's virality should not be seen merely as superficial consumption. On the contrary, often these short quotes spark interest in reading his complete works. Young people who come across him through a 60-second video may end up reading On the Shortness of Life or the Letters to Lucilius. Thus, digital culture works as a gateway to an ancient philosophy. This movement shows that, despite the speed and superficiality of much of online content, there is room for depth when it is presented in an accessible and engaging way. Pop culture, in turn, incorporates Seneca in various ways. Series, films, and even song lyrics have already referenced his ideas about life and death. In a world obsessed with eternal youth and unlimited consumption, his warnings against wasting time and against enslavement to money take on an almost countercultural tone. At the same time, his philosophy of serenity in the face of death resonates in dramatic narratives where characters seek courage to face the end. This indirect presence shows that Seneca is no longer just a philosopher. He has become a cultural archetype, a symbol of wisdom in the face of life's brevity. Thus, Seneca goes viral not only because he writes impactful phrases, but because he offers real answers to universal dilemmas. He adapts naturally to the fast format of social media and at the same time resists superficiality because each phrase contains a depth that invites reflection. On YouTube, Instagram, podcasts, or in literature, he continues to be the same Roman philosopher who wrote to Lucilius, but now speaks to billions of digital Lucilius scattered across the world. And perhaps this is the greatest sign of his greatness. Even in a century of speed and noise, his words still manage to silence for a few moments the rush of the world and remind us of what is essential. Seneca's legacy is not only in his preserved words, but in the coherence between life, thought, and death. He lived through one of the most turbulent periods in Roman history, was at the center of power, experienced wealth, exile, and persecution, but managed to transform each of these experiences into a source of wisdom. His philosophy was not conceived as a distant theory, but as a survival guide in a world marked by instability, injustice, and fragility. This proximity to real life is what ensures that his ideas remain alive and relevant more than 2,000 years later. In Seneca, we find the portrait of the human being who, despite contradictions, seeks to live with dignity. His critiques of slavery to money, his warnings about the brevity of life, his reflections on friendship and virtue, his courage in the face of pain, and his serenity in the face of death form a set of teachings that do not age. They resonate because they address themes that never change: time slipping away, anxiety about the future, blinding vanity, the need to find meaning in existence. Seneca reminds us that, behind historical changes, the human condition remains the same, and therefore philosophy must be a daily exercise, not an abstract theory. Perhaps his greatest teaching is the unity between living and dying. He showed that those who learn to live consciously do not fear death, and those who accept death learn to live better. This lesson is revolutionary in any era, but especially in a 21st century that avoids speaking of death and tries to artificially prolong life without necessarily giving it depth. Seneca reverses the logic. It does not matter how many years we have, what matters is how we inhabit them. To live fully is an act of courage, and to die serenely is the crowning of that courage. The impact of his philosophy can also be felt in how it continues to inspire different cultural and spiritual traditions. For medieval Christians, Seneca seemed like a moral precursor. For Renaissance humanists, he was a guide of practical wisdom. For moderns, he became a master of introspection, and today in the digital universe, he is a counselor for millions who find in his short quotes the clarity they cannot find in complex treatises. This passage across times and audiences shows that his message belongs to all humanity. In the end, Seneca's eternal legacy is to remind us that philosophy should not be an intellectual ornament, but an art of living. He calls us to cultivate time, to value authentic bonds, to deal with pain without despair, to treat wealth with detachment, and to face death without fear. This inheritance is greater than any political power he exercised or fortune he accumulated. It is the legacy of a man who knew how to transform his life, with all its contradictions, into a universal lesson. That is why Seneca remains the philosopher who teaches both how to live and how to die. His voice reaches us as an urgent call: do not waste time, do not fear death, do not enslave yourself to money, do not live for others but for yourself, and, above all, seek the serenity that is born from virtue. This is the inheritance that crosses centuries and guarantees him an eternal place among the great masters of humanity.